3000 NFL mock draft.
3000 NFL mock draft.
With your friends Kenneth and Rob. Talking about the NFL and the draft and the Seahawks. 3000 NFL mock draft. 3000 NFL mock draft.
That's what it is, 3000 NFL mock draft with Kenneth and Rob. I'm Kenneth Arthur of fieldgoals.com. With me, as always, Rob Staten, the resident draft and college football expert that I pluck and ply information from every week about these young kids and you know that are coming into the NFL and maybe coming in the NFL next year. We can talk about some of the 2017 prospects now that 2016 is out of the way. But there's still plenty to talk about with it regards to the 2016 NFL draft, the rookies, and the guys that are in Seahawks camp. Rookie mini camps and all that kind of stuff happened last week, the weekend, and you about these guys necessarily. You might get a few things about the way the guys may look as far as speed goes, or just impressing coaches with their ability to work hard or adapt to the being a professional, and that's kind of the stuff. But as far as Germain Ifedi goes, these guys aren't in pads. Jarran Reed, there's not so much that you can really as much learn as far as on-field ability when these guys aren't wearing pads. But we're going to do our best as usual. That's what we try to aim for. Do our best. And so, Rob, do your best. What did you think of the reports coming out of Seahawks rookies mini camp this week?
Well, it's hard to sort of know who did well and who didn't without sort of trying to read into what was said afterwards by Pete Carroll. He seemed to be pretty pleased with the way that the whole thing had gone. He was sort of talking about the leadership role that Germain Ifedi had taken and Jarran Reed, which is good to see. And we kind of expected those two guys to do that. The Seahawks spent a lot of time on sort of the character side of the game, and they were never going to take two players early who were not going to be sort of, people, the type of player that people gravitate towards. So no big surprise there that those two guys are going to slot in. They're going to do a good job for the Seahawks. They're going to start quickly. Carroll, I think, said that it's like they got 2 first-round picks, and that is kind of how it feels. Because Jarran Reed fell when he probably shouldn't have fallen as far as he did. And from the rest of the group, there's a potential there for 1 or 2 others to come in and have a nice impact. Carroll spoke very positively about the running backs. I think perhaps the most interesting player from the whole draft is going to be Reese Odiambo, because he was a player that we know that they liked, because Tony Pauline has been mentioning him with the Seahawks for several weeks before the draft. They took him in the 3rd round, which nobody kind of expected, and it was almost like they felt they had to leave the draft with him. They couldn't risk not taking him at that point, having traded up to go and get Jarran Reed and losing their 4th round pick. They had to have Odiambo. They took him in round 3, perhaps a bit earlier than a lot of other teams would have taken him. But Tom Cable just seems to really like this guy. And I watched a mic'd up segment on the Seahawks website, which I would recommend everybody going to see. Nice little 2-minute video of Tom Cable coaching the guys. And they're doing a triple block session. So this has just been one of the combination of blocks that they do in their scheme. And you don't really see them execute this off camera, but you hear Cable saying, O can do a triple block, O can do a triple block. And O is Odiambo. That's what he's calling him. And then as soon as Odiambo pulls away from the block, Cable points at him and goes, "That was awesome," or something. "That was amazing," and was sort of gushing with his praise. And sometimes you can just tell from someone's language and their body language how they like somebody, or like a coach likes a particular player. And it just seems that Cable has taken a shine to Odiambo. So while we're trying to project what the Seahawks are going to do with their offensive line, and it's still way too early to sort of work out how this is going to play out, I don't think it'd be a surprise at all if Odiambo claims that left guard starting spot and snatches it away from Mark Glowinski when we eventually get into training camp, which would set up a very inexperienced line, but a bigger line, perhaps a line more akin to sort of a new plan, power running, but with the zone blocking obviously at its heart. And I think that'd be an interesting thing to follow. And the other interesting thing I would point out from that video was the coaching that Tom Cable did with Joey Hunt. And he was showing Joey Hunt that you can sort of shuffle along the line and you can square off against these guys in college, and that's fine. but it will not be that way in the NFL. And he was kind of encouraging him to be sort of more aggressive, to sort of finish these blocks, to drive people off the ball and not just contain. And I think that's going to be one of the big challenges for Joey Hunt because of his size and how he transitions into this. It's going to be a wide open competition. We find out that Justin Britt's going to be in that competition as well. So you've got Joey Hunt, Justin Britt, and Patrick Lewis, and I guess Christian Sicoli as well, competing for that spot. And, that is, for me, the most competitive starting spot probably on the roster right now. Who nails that center spot is going to be very interesting to follow.
Yeah, and I think everybody's been interested in the depth at cornerback. There's 8 or 9 guys. There's like, these guys could all make the roster. There's a lot going on with the secondary, and Brandon Browner moving to safety. What do you make of the secondary right now? Mohamed Cisse getting released and then picked back up when he cleared through waivers and put on the injured list, and so things get clearer, but as far as why they brought in Browner and one less guy maybe to compete with Burley and Simon and Smith for the other cornerback spots, what do you make of at the in the secondary right now?
Well, they have a lot of options. The Carroll has talked about they like the depth that they have there, and the other thing about the Seahawks is that they seem to like their guys who have come through their system. When a lot of people were projecting the Seahawks were going to take a cornerback early, I don't think they're ever going to do that, because unless it's an exceptional talent, unless they were ever in a position to take, for example, looking at this draft class, Jalen Ramsey, just to use one example there. Because when you look at the way that they've done this, the ones that have done well are the guys who they've been able to coach up, teach the technique, and they've spent a lot of time sort of learning that. And that's where they've had their success. And, Byron Maxwell has gone away and has not had the same success out of this system playing a different technique. And it suggests that maybe the best thing about the Seahawks, this is, no disrespect to Richard Sherman if he happens to stumble across this podcast, which I doubt. I guess that maybe you could argue that
I don't doubt it. Come on. Well, if you just say his name, I think he automatically has to.
You think he's like, his ears are burning now? His kind of head just tilted, and he immediately Googled the podcast.
Well, first we have to say Richard Sherman is not the best cornerback in the NFL. You have to get that quoted and get that soundbite out there, and then we'll get him to listen.
Is it something like, I don't know, the lights when Batman is signaled to come and help someone? There's like
definitely. I would say definitely.
Outline of the tip shows in the Seattle skyline, and he sort of reaches for a laptop or something.
If you say Doug Baldwin is overrated or something like that, Doug Baldwin, I actually would not put that past him. He probably does listen or read anything that criticizes him. From what I understand, though, I've never really checked, Justin Britt will block people that never even contact him on Twitter. Maybe he'd have to search out his name and I think block people just for saying things about him. And I think those are pretty much the only people that Justin Britt's been blocking. So there you go.
That's tough for Justin Britt. For all the players in the NFL to have a complex about what people say on social media about them. Justin Britt's probably the worst person to have that issue. I imagine there's quite a lot said about him, in particular during that Carolina playoff game. But to go back to, I think that the technique thing is clearly a big deal in the Seahawks, and that perhaps that it's that and the scheme and Pete Carroll's influence. And Chris Richard and all of the guys there who have an impact on this is perhaps the most important thing for the Seahawks. And therefore, having players who sort of played within their system and learned this is the most important thing. So, Browner comes back. He knows the technique. They've got a load of other guys that they're working with. Some have been there for a year now. And I think it's going to be a kind of a fun competition, but there's no pressure there because they've re-signed Jeremy Lane. They've still got Deshaun Shedd. They've still got the core group that did well for them towards the end of last year when they sort of righted the ship and the secondary was back to normal. If they had to play Browner at corner again, they could do that, and they know what he brings. And then there's one or two others that you hope emerge. You hope that maybe Ty Smith's going to come forward, or Stanley Jean-Baptiste is going to. You could just reel off several different names that are on that group that might show forward and start to develop into a big role. Terrell Simon's another one. So they actually got a few interesting guys there. So the Mo Cisse news, if he is injured, I'm not entirely surprised they've sort of injured waived him and then sort of tried to keep him back and maybe sort of keep him on the roster for next year's camp. But they've got some very good options, and it was a bit baffling why a lot of the media, if you went on NFL.com, they listed Seattle's needs as D-line, O-line, and cornerback. And Mel Kiper kept giving the Seahawks a cornerback in round 1 in his mock drafts. And he kind of thought, well, this isn't a need, really. You know, they have a lot of depth at cornerback. And I'm not quite sure why anybody sort of ever felt that was such a crucial need.
It's a surprising amount of, ignorance for someone to be a draft expert and to mock a cornerback to the Seahawks in round 1, unless it was like a massive steal. If you had a guy that had been projected as a top 10 pick that had fallen to 26, and you were just like, well, I think this guy's not going to be, I don't think this guy's as highly valued, but I think the Seahawks can't get away from him. And you would say, like, look, Mel, if you have done if anybody's out there, and yeah, there was a lot of people saying the Seahawks need a corner, because of the fact that they had such a problem there at the beginning of last season with Kerry Williams, and it took a while for it to adjust. And it's like, yeah, they could use another body back there that fits within their profile of what they like to do. But if you knew anything about the Seahawks and you knew anything about John, they do not. It's just like the way that people are like, oh, how are they winning all these games? They must have these crazy schemes. And it's like, no, they're showing you right up on front, right up on top. They're running very basic concepts, and they're showing you what they're going to do, and they're not afraid for you to test them because they believe that they have better athletes. And it's the same way with the draft. They aren't pulling any wool over anyone's eyes every single year. They have drafted 3 offensive linemen in their first-round picks out of the last 4 first-round picks, not counting Earl Thomas. So out of the last 5 first-round picks, they've drafted 3 offensive linemen. They drafted Russell Okung, James Carpenter, and Jermaine Ifedi. If you can't sort of look at it and then look at the same token and say they have never drafted a cornerback higher than the 4th round, I think. And it's like, do you not understand that they don't need to draft cornerbacks that high because they don't have that same philosophy, not even counting the fact that they have Richard Sherman. So it's like when you have Richard Sherman and Earl Thomas and Cam Chancellor and a bunch of other bodies like Thorold Simon and Jeremy Lane, who's proven that he can play out there, and they're not afraid to move out of Brian Maxwell. They're not afraid to pick up a Brandon Browner from the CFL. They're not afraid to put someone in there they don't need to just go out there and say, well, we better find another guy that can be a number 1 corner. No, nobody needs that. It's not a thing in the NFL. If you've got a number 1 corner like Richard Sherman, then you don't need a number 1 corner to shut down a team's number 2 receiver most of the time. Or you don't need 2 guys doing the same job when most teams don't have 2 guys that need to match up with a Richard Sherman level cornerback. So it's like they're not going to be drafting a cornerback in the 1st round or probably even the 2nd round until Richard Sherman is gone, which is not going to be for a while. They've got that filled. But even if they did, they got Richard Sherman in the 5th round. They draft these guys in the 5th and 6th round. They probably feel very confident in the fact that Stanley John Baptiste can be their next Byron Maxwell or Brandon Browner. I think that they look at a guy like that and they say, great, he went to a team that didn't know how to utilize. They probably wanted to utilize him in the same way that we utilize Richard Sherman, but they don't know how to do that. So we're going to bring him in and we're going to try him out. Or they're feeling confident that Thorold Simon, maybe he'll be healthy this year. And they've got so many options. So for Mel Kiper to be like Artie Burns Jr., I mean, it just seems insane that you can be ESPN's NFL draft analyst for 25 years and still be mocking, someone like Artie Burns to the Seahawks and multiple other cornerbacks of the Seahawks in the 1st round. It's like you learned nothing and you didn't even try.
Well, I just think it's surprising because the teams at the back end of the 1st round are picking at the back end of the 1st round for a reason, and that's because they're generally well-organized franchises with established general managers and or head coaches. So, you kind of know what Dave Gettleman's going to do at Carolina. I mean, everybody worked out as soon as Josh Norman had left that this is a guy who values the defensive line more than anything and will not invest heavily in sort of the back end of the secondary. He's drafted linebackers and defensive linemen ahead of cornerbacks. So when he takes Vernon Butler in round 1, it's not a big surprise. But that's, nobody was really projecting a corner to Carolina because they knew what Gettleman was going to do. So that's fair enough. You could sort of look deep into what Pittsburgh Steelers have done over the years. They actually moved away from what they've usually done in drafting a cornerback in the first round. But even so, you understand that they like to take linebackers, defensive linemen, and offensive linemen early. And with the Seahawks, it's pretty simple what they do in terms of the draft. So I was a bit surprised, and it wasn't just Mel. I mean, like I said, the NFL.com listed cornerback as an unaddressed need. And I saw sort of grades coming out, and I thought the Seahawks had a fantastic draft. I mean, to see the Seahawks getting kind of like B grades and B plus, if we're going to judge this thing straight after the draft, then I find it very hard not to give the Seahawks sort of like an A for their draft, because they did address everything they had to address with players that fit perfectly what they looked for. And to sort of think, wow, well, they didn't take a cornerback. Well, there's probably a reason for that. I mean, like the Seahawks, if they really, really needed a cornerback, had ample opportunity to take one. I mean, they took 3 running backs, for crying out loud, and then didn't really address cornerback at all in undrafted free agency. And if that doesn't make you think, well, hang on a minute, maybe we called this one wrong, all you have to do is speak to really any Seahawks fan or anybody who covers the team to find out that cornerback wasn't really a need at all. And I'm surprised that maybe there wasn't a few texts or calls made to some of the local beat reporters, and just to sort of feel whether, how people keep opposing this cornerback need. Is it really a need? And they would have got the answer that they required. So you're right, 4th round, Walter Thurmond is the earliest the Seahawks have ever drafted a cornerback. He was a guy who could have gone in the 2nd round and fell due to injury. Apart from that, they've usually stuck to the sort of 5th round, 6th round for cornerbacks, and I don't think that's going to change anytime soon.
Speaking of the 5th round, as I look at the Seahawks draft class, the one that still sticks out to me, Alex Collins, 5th round, 171st overall. I think CJ Procise, who they drafted in the 3rd round, they obviously love, and I think we love him as an idea of, wow, think of what this guy could do when utilized with this offense, and he could be pass catching, blah, blah, blah. But Alex Collins, I heard him compared to Mark Ingram, and I'm just kind of curious, Rob, do you think that Alex Collins could be a guy who 2 years, 3 years down the line, we're calling one of the steals of the draft?
Well, possibly. I mean, there's a long history of, and you're aware of this, Kenny, because it's an argument that you've made many times on this podcast and others, that, a running back taken early is not necessarily the best investment. And while, I think one of the interesting things from the draft is going to be to sort of compare Zeke Elliott, for example, who went 4th overall to Dallas, to some of the guys who were taken later on, because the Cowboys have got a great offensive line. They've got some offensive weapons. They have issues on defense, and yet they sort of snubbed them to take a running back. So can Alex Collins, for example, or CJ Procise, or even Zach Brooks, or Thomas Rawls continuing his career from an undrafted free agent position, can they sort of do more than these guys going early? And when you look at Alex Collins, and I've watched a lot of his games again since he was drafted, the same with CJ Procise. But the thing with Alex Collins is that he's a really tough physical runner. The Seahawks love that. And while he may not be the most dynamic athlete, he's talked, I think, in a few interviews about his short steps and the way that he sort of keeps his base compact, and he changes direction very easily. He's got a great cutback ability. He finishes runs. I mean, he is basically a Seahawks running back in terms of his stature and his physicality and his attitude. And when you watch CJ Procise, he's a little bit different, but he glides and he is very smooth and he's physical and he finishes his runs. And he's got the experience at wide receiver. I think he's going to be used in many, many different ways, CJ Procise. I think that his main value to the Seahawks is going to be as a 2-minute drill running back and as a 3rd down running back. But, the Seahawks have a very defined 2-minute drill. So when they need a quick score, we've seen in the past Robert Turbin had come in. You wouldn't see Marshawn Lynch at all in the drive. Robert Turbin would come in, and then last year it was Fred Jackson. So when they want to quicken things up, they have a way of doing things to Seahawks. And it generally is pretty successful. How many times at the end of the first half, for example, have you seen Russell Wilson score a quick touchdown? I seem to remember the game against San Diego in 2014 was an example of that, of sort of quickening the pace, using Turbin a lot more than Marshawn Lynch, and it worked. And they can use that with CJ Procise. And he's a really nice complement to what they already have on the roster. So the Seahawks have got a pretty nice stable. You know, they haven't got Marshawn Lynch anymore, but what they have got, lots of different styles of running back. And if Rawls ever got injured, you could trust Procise, or you could trust Collins to do, you know, a really good job for you. It'd be interesting to see what Zach Brooks brings to the table as well. They've got some nice options there. So I'm very excited to see how this plays out. But I like the look of Seattle's backfield, and I will not be surprised at all if Alex Collins does become one of the steals of the draft.
So if I go down the Seahawks draft class and just sort of name them off one-on-one, I just want you, if you're willing to just sort of say where you think they'll be week one, whether it's starting this, starting up, and then say the position, reserve this position, practice squad, or just outright no longer with the team. So where do you see Germain Ifedi in week one?
Well, I think Germain Ifedi will start. I think that, there's still a bit of work to do as to whether he will be the right guard or the right tackle. I think that's something to monitor. I don't think, as much as they might want to try him at right guard initially, let's just see how this plays out. Maybe there is a chance that he and Webb will swap positions down the line, and they're both very similar. But either way, Germain Ifedi is going to start in 2016.
Jerron Reed.
Again, he's come in for a reason. That is to start. That is to play a little one technique, some three technique. Wouldn't be surprised to see him at the 5 as well. In certain situations, he's played the end at Alabama. So I think he's going to be very, very much a key starter for the Seahawks defensive line rotation.
CJ Procise.
So as we just discussed, I think a third down running back predominantly, and a 2-minute drill running back who sort of takes over from the role that we kind of saw Robert Turbin establish in 2012 and 2013. And,
does he see a significant, noticeable amount of snaps at wide receiver?
Perhaps so. I mean, he the good thing with him is that we heard Carroll talk about this, is that they love to go with an empty backfield. And I know it's a bugbear for a lot of Seahawks fans that they go empty, that they want to see them running the ball. They want to see them using the I formation or keep a fullback in there. But the way that the league's going, it's perhaps not exactly beneficial to do that. And the great thing about empty is that, you can line up with a running back there, have a good look at the defense, and you can decide, okay, we're going to throw the ball. And it completely changes the way that if a defense is lining up to defend the run, and then you just split CJ Procise out wide, and they've got the wrong personnel and a bad mismatch on him, or they have to draw some attention to Procise, and that opens up something for Jimmy Graham or Nick Vannett or Luke Wilson, then you have the upper hand as an offense. And I think that that's one of the big things with Procise, is that they feel that that's going to give them yet another mismatch, another thing that a team has to be wary of. They love to go empty backfield, and I think that Procise is kind of Thomas Rawls is pretty good at that as well, by the way. He showed some good hands last year, so they've got a couple of options there that could be really beneficial for them.
Nick Vannett.
He's going to be a tough one to work out, because I watched a couple of his games since the draft, and I think he's a terrific blocker at the college level. I mean, his game against Notre Dame was superb. I mean, he basically nailed every single block. Offered absolutely nothing as a receiver, by the way. His route running is pretty just tepid. I mean, there's nothing. It doesn't that he does anything wrong. It's just there's no snap. I mean, he runs a short route and it's kind of labored. He kind of goes through the motions with his routes and then a shorter. And then when he gets down the seam again, it's not an explosive. Wow, he's straight in there attacking a linebacker. You see the mismatch. So I think there's something to work on there. It's just whether or not he can, in year one, be an effective NFL blocker. And I've no doubt his heart and his mind will be in the right place. The want to do it will be there, but actually executing in year one is going to be difficult for him. And if you remember Zach Miller, who people are sort of comparing him to, he had a couple of really productive years at Oakland as a receiver before coming to Seattle, and he'd been in the league for I think 3 or 4 years already as a starter before he came to Seattle and did that job. So whether Nick Vannett can come in immediately and have that type of an impact, I'm not sure. So I'm going to go on a conservative side with him and project that maybe he will be used as a situational blocker, an extra tackle for the most part on certain situations, and a red zone option. His size and his ability in the red zone, I think, is going to be something that's good for the Seahawks, especially if Jimmy Graham is not there to start the year. But as a kind of like an overall, multi-use tight end, I think he's going to be pretty limited there.
What if you had a situation where Russell Wilson, the offense, comes out there, and who's on the field besides the 5 offensive linemen and Russell Wilson? That let's say that the other 5 guys are Jimmy Graham, Luke Wilson, Nick Vannett, CJ Prosise at the running back, and Doug Baldwin. Could that's sort of like, what the fuck? How do we, what now what? Do you think that having that many big guys and that many unique, versatile players on the field is possible even?
Yeah, it's possible. I mean, the only problem we've got there is that if you're lining up Graham, Vannett, and Wilson, and your only receiver is Doug Baldwin in that situation, as I would be tempted as a defense to combat that with saying, okay, we're going to play nickel, we're going to line, our best cornerback up with Doug Baldwin, we're going to put cornerbacks on the tight ends and sort of back them to stay in coverage and minimize any big plays. That okay, they might, if it's a jump ball situation, we might lose that matchup, but they're not going to be wide open. And then I would sort of be comfortable sort of putting maybe a safety and linebacker on Graham, and then sort of keeping somebody in, one of the linebackers, to keep an eye on Prosise. So, it sounds great, to have big bodies, to sort of think that that's the way that you're going to win. I think that would be an effective running formation because you've got a lot of guys who can block there, plus the option of Graham. If Graham just runs a route and then you've got 2 blocking tight ends in there, then it's going to be very difficult to stop that if you've got the physicality and if Seattle's O-line can run block as we all hope. But in terms of a passing situation, I think that the need, and then one of the reasons why the Seahawks have kind of taken guys like Paul Richardson and why they use Doug Baldwin and why they've got Tyler Lockett, is that they want, suddenness in your ability to get open quickly. And that is, when Russell Wilson has excelled. Russell Wilson is not, for all of his great abilities, he's not a great, okay, Jimmy Graham's covered here, I'll throw it to a spot where only he can get it or where he has the best chance to get it. He's not a risk taker like that. He wants to see his guys open, which is not a flaw because, he doesn't turn the ball over that much. But unless he's throwing it downfield where the risk's minimal anyway, he doesn't like to throw guys open like that. So I'm not sure that there'd be a major benefit having that many big bodies on, considering they're probably not going to create separation.
Thank you for that answer. I want to remind everyone that I'm in character as an idiot. That I'm in character as a guy. It's like, hey, I'm talking to Rob, the expert, and there I was in character, just coming up with something on the fly, and Rob handled that beautifully as far as why it may or may not make any sense to have 3 tight ends on the field, those big guys. But number 97 overall, Reese Adiambo, obviously we spoke about him earlier. You said this could be Cable's guy. And suddenly out of nowhere, I'm almost feeling a jam up, like there aren't enough spots on the offensive line for everybody that we like when you conclude Mark Glowinski and the battle at center. So where do you see Reese Adiambo?
Well, I just think that he is so interesting because it's kind of like he's the odd one out to an extent, because I think most people, if you spoke to most sort of dedicated Seahawks fans, so like I'm talking about people like me and you, Kenny, and the people who listen to the podcast, the people who like live and breathe this stuff, as opposed to sort of like the fan who sort of dips in and out and doesn't spend too much time obsessing about offensive line lineups, which I imagine is the majority of the fan base, to be fair. But if you sort of speak to anybody like us, we will say, okay, well, Mark Glowinski is the left guard and Jermaine Ifedi is the right guard, and that's pretty much going to be sorted that way. But just they seem to be enamored with this guy. I mean, they've taken him in the 3rd round, which is earlier than anybody else, which is in spite of all of the injury issues that he's had. I mean, this is a team that said in the offseason, our main priority is to get healthier on the O-line. That they wanted to just stay healthy there. They've let Russell Okung up because he's not healthy enough to sort of trust to do that anymore. They don't want to spend big money on him because he can't stay on the field. And yet they've spent a 3rd round pick on Reese Adiambo. They must love this guy, because to take him that early when there was other players who could have played center, for example, which seemed like a bigger need because they've got Glowinski and because they've got others, but no, they take him. and you see the way that Tom Cable acts around him, and then you maybe consider that, last year, Mark Glowinski was never considered really to come in for Justin Britt. He never really challenged for that left guard spot. He was the backup to J.R. Sweezy. He played one game, and there was almost a sense of surprise that he played as well as he did after the game, when Carroll said, well, it's good. At least we know he can play now. So while people are ready to crown Glowinski the starting left guard, I think this is going to be a really, really interesting battle. They like this guy, Odiambo. And when you sort of watch him, he's a left tackle who would kick inside. That is what they've traditionally gone with at left guard. They haven't put pure guards in there like Glowinski. They've put converted tackles in there. His footwork is great. He keeps everything in front of him. His footwork, he can recover if he sort of loses a bit of leverage in terms of first step quickness from a defensive end. He recovers very well. His footwork is excellent. I think you'd like to see a bit more of a aggression, a bit more of an edge towards him, a bit like we saw with Sean Coleman. You kind of want to see that edge in his play, but at the same time, that's really the only thing that's lacking there. And if he can sort of come in and if he can stay healthy, it would not surprise me whatsoever if he was the week one starter at left guard.
I feel like I'm starting to think of this next guy as sort of 2016's forgotten man. It's the kind of guy that you might look back at some of the other Seahawks draft classes and think, oh yeah, we did draft that guy. And it seems like almost immediately that guy has become Quentin Jefferson. Maybe it's because the Seahawks didn't have a 5th round pick and had to give up a future 4th round pick to get in and draft Jefferson, which would make you believe that they were pretty high on this guy out of Maryland. But if you asked me to ask, if before this podcast, if you had told me to name the 10 guys the Seahawks drafted, Quentin Jefferson would have been the name that I struggled with. And I don't know necessarily why that is, but I just feel like I can't get a grasp on who this guy is. So what are your thoughts on Quentin Jefferson's week one hopes?
Well, I don't think he's ever going to be, a starter per se. I don't think you're ever going to sort of imagine him starting for the Seahawks. I think that he's kind of the player that we expected him to take. It's just that there are two things that are working against Quentin Jefferson in terms of us being able to diagnose him. One is there is no tape of him on Draft Breakdown. There is nothing. And I don't have any Maryland games saved on my system. So the only way to watch him play is to watch Yannick Ngakoue and sort of keep an eye on where he is, which is not particularly easy because without the sort of little arrow saying this is Quentin Jefferson every snap, he could line up in a different position every time. And these defensive linemen, they're all kind of 300 pounds. They all kind of look the same. So it's very difficult to determine who's who without it being pointed out to you on the screen. So that was one thing. And two, he didn't really do sort of do a lot of the stuff pre-draft, to generate much of a buzz. So I did have a few people on the blog, sort of on the comment section, saying, "What about this guy? He did a good workout." And we never really. I should have perhaps sort of paid more attention to that because what we felt they were looking for was a defensive lineman who could play end in base and then kick inside on passing downs. And he has the perfect size for that. He's 6'4", 291 pounds, 33.5-inch arms, which is great. Everything the Seahawks look for. He ran a 4.93, which is pretty good for his size. And his short shuttle, and this is a key thing, his short shuttle was 4.37. The Seahawks spend a lot of time looking at these short shuttle times. If you look at Jordan Hill's, his is pretty good. I think that I'm trying to think of the other guys who had a good short shuttle. I think that the guy that they took in the 4th round, I think he had a pretty similar one to Jordan Hill. The guy who's now at Kansas City, whose name I can't remember. The Florida defensive lineman. His was pretty good as well. So this is 4.37 is just to sort of, if you want me to compare it to other people in this class, a 4.37 short shuttle compares to Jonathan Bullard's 4.56. It's 0.2 of a second quicker than Jonathan Bullard, which is not to be sniffed at. Joey Bosa ran a 4.21. 4.37 for Quentin Jefferson. It was one of the best performances among all defensive linemen. Dean Lowry was the most athletic defensive lineman at the combine. He ran a 4.38. That's 0.01 seconds slower than Quinton Jefferson in the short shuttle. This is a test the Seahawks spend a lot of time on with their defensive linemen. It's that short area quickness, change of direction, recovery, reaction. It's that kind of it's a real test of your agility, which is the biggest test really for a defensive lineman. And he excelled there. So you can kind of forget everything else. Look at that. Look at his size. That is why the Seahawks drafted him. I've watched some highlights of him since. He looks like a really quick twitch interior pass rusher. So he's not going to be a starter. He is going to be like a nickel defender. But I will not be surprised at all if he kind of just competes with Jordan Hill and maybe wins that job to be the guy who comes in and certain downs and distance and just sort of has that impact. You know, they need to fill a 5.5 sack hole. If haven't heard the previous podcast, 2013, Clinton McDonald, 5.5 sacks. 2014, Jordan Hill, 5.5 sacks. 2015, Jordan Hill, 0 sacks. They lost 5.5 sacks production from that role. They need to find that back. And it wouldn't be a total shock if Quinton Jefferson was trusted to do that role ahead of Jordan Hill.
In the fifth round, we also had Alex Collins, who we touched on briefly. What are your thoughts?
I think that he's going to have a role, but I think it's going to be as the number 2 running back, competing with Christian Michael for that. I mean, he's kind of like the forgotten man as we talk about all these running backs that they've drafted. They're going to push Christian Michael. I think that he'll make the roster one way or another, Alex Collins. I think that round 5, it's too early to sort of throw them away at that point. You know, I know that they've kind of thrown away 4th round picks at receiver in the past. As long as Alex Collins turns up and works hard, even if he doesn't win the job of number 2 and Christian Michael wins that, then I think they're going to keep a roster spot for him and just keep some depth at that position in the post-Marshawn Lynch era. Marshawn Lynch was incredibly durable up until 2015.
Let's not forget that, I mean, Alex Collins, I mean, when you're talking about guys that you want to put on the practice, do that with maybe some of the Zach Brooks or someone that you picked up an undrafted free agency. But if you don't retain Alex Collins and Quentin Jefferson, they will be on other teams. There's no getting them to the practice squad. Yeah,
they will be gone. There's very little. If you are cutting either of those 2 guys, you're cutting them because you're prepared to lose them essentially. So I think that there'll be a role for him on the roster. The question is whether or not he can beat out Christian Michael. There's not going to be a guaranteed spot for Christian Michael on this roster. He's going to have to earn that spot more than anybody on this team probably. He is fighting for his life, Christian Michael, especially now they've drafted 3 running backs. So he's going to be the one under pressure, and it's going to be a case of can Collins win the number 2 role? If he doesn't, then he's going to be sort of buried on the depth chart because he'd be number 3, and then you've got CJ Procise as the 3rd down and 2-minute drill running back. So, you know, he'd be stuck behind a few bodies there. But I'm pretty sure that unless he turns up at camp and has a terrible camp, that he's going to be on the roster.
Joey Hunt, can he be the starting? Will he be the starting center in week 1?
Initially, I thought yes, just because of how positively they talked about him. And then I watched his tape and I thought he looked pretty good despite the size. He does sort of he struggles against length, as you'd expect. He's got short arms and he's small. So when a long defensive lineman gets into him, shoves him back, he can get off balance, and it gets quite ugly. He's going to have to do better in that situation because he's going to come up against some big, long, explosive defensive linemen. But then, so I did think initially yes, but now as I've kind of like time has moved on, I really don't have an answer for this because I just think that any of them could win it. I don't think that Christian Sokoli is going to start. I think that everything that Carroll says is that basically he's raw. And I don't think he goes from being still incredibly raw to a starting NFL center in the next few weeks. And they just seem to talk when you know when a guy is going to get a chance because they talk a lot more positively than they're talking about Christian Sokoli right now. So I think that the starter could easily be Patrick Lewis. He's got a relationship with Jermaine Ifedi. He finished the season last year, and apart from the Carolina game, did pretty well. They know he can do the job. He's kind of like a safe hedge for them. to get them through the first few weeks of the season and then maybe assess the situation. They know that he can snap the ball. They know that he can play center. Maybe Joey Hunt's got a bit more upside down the road. But I just think he's gonna need maybe a bit too much work doing there. He's gonna have to wow them, whereas Patrick Lewis just has to keep doing what he's doing. And I think it's as it's going to be a wide open competition. If I had to predict anything right now, I think that Patrick Lewis will probably be the starter and Joey Hunt will probably be the backup.
Well, they say that Kenny Lawler might have had the best hands in the NFL draft this year, and which tells me he must do a lot of things really wrong because he is a wide receiver and he went in the 242 guys went ahead of him. So that tells me that Kenny Lawler, if he has the best hands in the draft, means like if you sort of build a player in Madden or a golfer in Tiger Woods or something like that, it's like when you pump up one thing to 11 and literally just leave everything else on 0. Now that might be ignorant of me, and that might be a little bit of a guessing game on my part. But with so much talk about how good Kenny Lawler's hands are, for him to go 243rd overall, it tells me that there's not a great chance of him having all the other tools necessary, because it's not like I heard anything about his character, and it's not like I heard anything about injuries. I mean, it was just this reason here. There are guys like Antonio Brown who go in the 6th round and is possibly the best receiver in the NFL. But where do you see Kenny Lawler this season?
It's hard to project because they do have spots available. I know I've noticed that while we've been recording this podcast, the Seahawks have announced a press conference for later in the week, which is going to be about Ricardo Lockett. So I think that Lockett's probably going to retire, and that's sad news. But it seemed inevitable given the serious nature of his injury. So that's one player that they've kind of got to replace somehow. And then you look at the sort of little project they had with Chris Matthews that didn't work out. That leaves open another spot. Now the two Washington receivers are still on the roster. Case and Williams and Smith, and they could easily take one or both of those spots. And that's kind of who Kenny Lawler's competing with for me. He's competing to sort of replace the two sort of spots that Lockett and Matthews have vacated. So in that sense, it's not impossible for him. What he's going to have to show is, can he make enough big plays? Because that was what Lockett's role was. Lockett didn't do anything, but then there'd be a game where all of a sudden he'd catch a 50-yard touchdown pass. Or, if you remember the big touchdown against Denver in 2014, towards the right corner of the end zone. You had the flea flicker against Carolina last season, which he caught over the defensive back. He wouldn't do anything for weeks, and then he'd have a massive game. So Kenny Lawler has to prove in camp that he can be an impact guy, so that Kenny Lawler will be on the roster and doesn't do anything, and then week 4 turns up, catches a 50-yard touchdown pass because he's caught one over the defensive back. That's one thing he has to prove. 2, he has to prove he can play special teams, which is going to be vital, and that's probably what it's going to come down to. Who is the better special teams player? Is it Casey Williams? Is it Kevin Smith? Or is it Kenny Lawler? And I guess 3, he's going to have to add some weight pretty quickly, because watching him in the little highlight reel the Seahawks put out there, I noticed that Pete Carroll said he'd actually lost weight since the combine, and he looks like he has. I mean, at the moment, Kenny Lawler looks like the 13, 14-year-old boy who goes to the gym for the first time. The tall, 6'4", wannabe athlete who hasn't grown into his body yet. His arms are incredibly skinny. He has no weight on him whatsoever. I mean, I don't think there's anybody in the NFL right now with so little muscle definition than Kenny Lawler. I mean, he's skinny. He's very skinny. And, you can have the best hands in the world. If you can't get off press, if you're getting jammed at the line, you're going to make life very difficult for yourself. And he has to get stronger, and he has to be able to sort of handle the NFL physicality if he's going to have any role. So right now, I'm not overly confident he's going to make the roster. There might be just one or two others that are bigger and better placed than him to get there. But I think they're going to really like him, and I think they're going to like his character. And he's shown at Cal that he can make big plays for Jared Goff. So it wouldn't be a total shocker if he ended up being sort of the 2016 version of Ricardo Lockett.
It's amazing to me that anybody could be a Pac-12 wide receiver. You know, he was catching passes from he was catching passes from the number 1 overall pick, and he was right there. And it's just amazing to me that anybody could be a star football player in high school and college, a big college. Hit the weights, bro. Like, you know, you're in this great position. Girls probably want to get your number and everything. Like, build up some muscles. You're already out there working your ass off in practice and playing games. I'm surprised that anybody, you would think there must be some sort of genetics there, that it's just like, I have been lifting so much and it doesn't do anything, which is not necessarily good news for Kenny Lawler.
Well, you know, I mean, just on this, I mean, it is pretty difficult for some people. I mean, like, your diet has to be, if you ever want to gain muscle definition, or if you want to gain sort of good weight, you have to be eating a lot. So Kenny Lawler would have to, if he's not sort of a naturally muscular person, he would need to be working out, you know, to gain real muscle 2 or 3 times a week, working on, you know, different muscle groups. So like chest, arms, back, to sort of get that definition. And then he would have to be sort of piling in the protein, the carbs, you know, eating a lot of food every single day in order to sort of gain the muscle mass. And that could make him sluggish, slow. You know, it's someone who has sort of tried to sort of do this, you know, to have a diet like this to try and bulk up. You can feel pretty sluggish because you're kind of forcing food down your mouth. You know, you're forcing stuff like chicken and rice and pasta and meat and steak down your throat, not because you're hungry, but because your body needs it to build muscle. So if he sort of felt like he wasn't able to perform in that, and because his sort of thing is his hands and his ability to catch and high point and make spectacular plays, it might be something where the people at Cal said, look, just focus on your craft, be technically good. And the Seahawks, you know, they're a pro football team. They're going to have a way for him to gain muscle, but I just don't think he's ever going to be.
Yeah, introduce him to David Boston and LaRon Landry.
Yeah, yeah, that's one possibility. I think that what they will probably try and do is just sort of build up his upper body. And maybe some of the legs, you know, maybe some more explosion in the legs, create that sort of explosive get off. But I think the main thing is to sort of improve that chest and get some bicep work in there. Biceps are very difficult to work out.
Talk to the guys that are at the gym and they literally only do biceps.
Yeah, that's a stupid thing to do. I mean, like the whole point, if you want to have big arms, don't just do your biceps over and over again. That's the stupidest thing. Your biceps will get worked out when you're doing sort of like shoulder work and all sorts of, you know, back work. Your bicep, anything that involves your arms, your bicep is getting a workout there. The whole, if you want to get muscle definition, is to do a series of all of the muscle groups in your upper body, and your bicep, and then your arms will get bigger anyway. So, you know, just focusing on the bicep will just give you one muscle. You've got to sort of on that. So I think that Kenny, they will have a plan for him, which will not take away the attention of the technique and the learning the playbook he's going to do. May just enable him to put on, I don't know, like 15 pounds of good weight in his upper body.
Yeah, yeah. We should. I mean, we've mentioned. You know, Rob, you're pretty. You know about working out. We should talk. We should do more workout chat on 3000 NFL Mock.
Well, we have got a long summer ahead, Kenny. So.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, it's been. I just hit like sort of the 1 year anniversary of me going to the gym. It's been about. It's been a year and 10 days and sort of my recommitment to the gym. And it's been more difficult as more work comes in for me to go every single day or 5 days a week. And I could use the motivation. Even just talking about it, it just makes me think like, okay, I'm only going twice a week. But if we talk more about doing all the muscle groups, I'll be like, oh yeah, maybe we'll have a segment on 3000 NFL Mock Draft called 3000 Curls or something like that, where we can talk about the different workouts and how to prevent injuries and stuff like that. Final pick is Zach Brooks. I think I know where this is going, but where do you see Zach Brooks?
Well, Zach Brooks, I think they took him in their last pick. I think they took him because they knew it would be very difficult to sign him in free agency, having already drafted Alex Collins and CJ Procise with Thomas Rawls and Christian Michael already on the roster. So, if they thought, okay, we've got these linebackers that we haven't drafted a linebacker, so we can sell to these linebackers. Come to us, you're going to get a legitimate shot to start here. Bruce Irvin's gone. We haven't drafted a linebacker. We've got these defensive linemen that we're going to try. We're going to try one of them at fullback and stuff like that. It would have been very difficult for them to sign Zach Brooks, I think, in free agency. So I think they took him because they really liked him, and it was essentially. It was like a franchise tag for the undrafted free agent market. It was like, hey, we can just have this guy for definite, and then we can get all the other guys we still want anyway. So I think that's why they took him. I mean, he's fighting an uphill battle to have a roster spot, let alone to have any significant role. But they clearly liked him. They want to add him to the competition. There's nothing wrong with that, and he's sort of competing. I don't really know who with, because he's pretty similar to CJ Procise. So I think he's somebody that they can bring in. They will hope that they can stash in the practice squad down the line. And, teams have been quick to snap up running backs that the Seahawks have cut. You look at sort of Turbin and the guy who went to Dallas last year. So it might be tough to keep him, but I think that the practice squad is going to be their plan.
Well, yeah, that's what I was going to say. It's like, Zach, you don't have a very good shot of making the Seahawks, but you are guaranteed to make the 49ers. So it's like you have a really good shot of going to another team that's like, and plus you're working with some of the best running back coaches and running backs in the NFL. I know Marshawn Lynch isn't here anymore, but, working with Thomas Rawls and learning from these guys, and you're going to have a wealth of knowledge. And absolutely, after you get cut, you will be getting phone calls from Arizona and St. Louis and other teams. And Robert Turbin, Kristen Michael, and Rod Smith and Spencer Ware all played significantly elsewhere last season. So there's plenty of future for running backs that are in this system. So I think Zach Brooks, I'm sure he is grateful, but his agent probably was like grumbling about being the third running back taken by a team that had two running backs already. But I think it's going to be really good for him overall, especially, I mean, you go in undrafted free agency and you sign with the Browns, like, then nobody's going to be taking notice of you if you don't make the team. And now going to the Seattle Seahawks, people will take notice of everybody that will get cut. Just as Davis Sue tweeted out what John Clayton said this week or last week, that 86 of the 90 players on the 2013 90-man roster were on rosters that year. That's insane. And it's like, that's what you could be looking at here right now with a very deep roster, a lot of talented guys that I think a significant portion of them will play significant snaps for teams that aren't the Seahawks this season. So that sort of wraps up the 2016 Seahawks draft class. And it does also wrap up this podcast. Rob, this week on Seahawks draftblog.com, people can go back and read some of last week's posts about Jerron Reed and Rees Adiambo, plus the 50 players to watch in the 2017 NFL draft. Rob, is there any sort of late first round pick, fingers crossed that's where the Seahawks will be again, is there any one guy that you're like, I would recommend watching and paying attention to this guy, an Adam Bisnowaty or a Harold Brantley? I don't know I know that you think that guy is good enough to be top 5 if he's healthy. But is there anyone that you're already starting to pay attention to for the Seahawks?
Yeah, there's quite a few. I mean, you mentioned a couple of them there. I mean, I like Adam Bisnowaty because I think that he's kind of got that Evan Mathis type body frame. Similar background as well. So, and was a big recruit to Pittsburgh. I think was the most recruited Pennsylvania lineman in years. So, an athlete who was a wrestler, who's played tackle and projects at guard, is very much a Seahawks type of player. So if they wanted to go offensive line again in a year's time, I mean, who knows what's going to happen there? But Adam Bisnowaty is someone to keep an eye on. Harold Brantley, if people don't know his backstory, he was involved in a car crash before the 2015 season, was lucky to survive and missed the whole year. He's a very, very talented interior defensive lineman, classic 3 technique. Hopefully he's going to be back to 100%. And Missouri churns out good defensive linemen pretty much every year. He's also going to get help. There's some decent edge rushers at Missouri. So if they take a lot of the pressure off the edge and a lot of the attention, it could mean for a bit of a bounce back comeback here for Harold Brantley. There's a guy called Jehu Chesson who plays for Michigan. He's a receiver. I think he came over from Africa a few years ago and is raw, but he's just got fantastic size. He's 6'3", about 210 pounds. If you want to know one of the reasons why I was so down on Vernon Hargreaves, this is the reason why. Chesson just gave him an absolute lesson in the Citrus Bowl. Just destroyed him. And Hargreaves went in the top 12. So, Chesson, he had a 96-yard return for a touchdown against Northwestern on a kick return, and he's 6'3" and 210 pounds. How many guys with that size do you see returning kicks at all, let alone running them back for 96-yard touchdowns? He's an incredible athlete, incredible size, major potential. The fact that Jim Harbaugh's there now, I think is going to, if they can put together a really functioning offense there, he could be a big time riser over the next 12 months. He's somebody to sort of keep an eye on there. And if the Seahawks want to add a different dynamic to their receiving group, they've taken receivers earlier, they've traded for receivers. He's certainly someone to keep an eye on, and it is a loaded running back class. If they wanted to sort of come back to that again, I don't think they're going to get anywhere near Leonard Fournette unless the season completely tanks, or Dalvin Cook for that matter. But there are one or two others. You look at someone like Samaj Perine, who broke Melvin Gordon's record for most yards in a game in college football history. You've got Royce Freeman at Oregon, who's an interesting player to watch. Nick Chubb, keep an eye on how he returns from injury. You've got Bo Scarborough, who is an enormous running back from Alabama, who is being titled as the next big thing in Alabama football. Is he going to be able to replace Derrick Henry immediately? And could he declare for the draft after just 1 year starting at Alabama? That's unusual for Alabama running backs, but he might sort of seize the opportunity there when he sees like Nick Chubb getting injured a year ago, for example. There's a lot. I could run through so many. Deshaun Hall, defensive end, Texas A&M, somebody I really like who could be an option.
Is there anybody that, we're sort of at that Sean Coleman stage or that Paxton Lynch stage where you aren't seeing anyone talk about them as a day one or day two pick, that it's like, why aren't more people paying attention to this guy? Maybe you were watching tape on someone else and the one guy that stood out to you was the guy covering him or the guy next to him. And yet at the same time, if you look ahead to 2017 rankings of players, like this is a really underrated guy that you think by next spring will be a first-round pick.
Well, there's a guy called Quinn Blanding who plays for Virginia, who is a former 5-star recruit. Doesn't get much attention at all because he plays for Virginia. But he was a big-time recruit. Whenever I've watched Virginia play, he seemed to sort of have an impact there. His name was mentioned an awful lot. So he's somebody to keep an eye on. I know a lot of people, I noticed Mel Kiper, for example, had the LSU safety sort of listed as somebody who is to keep an eye on. And I think that it's very easy to sort of just look at the LSU guys and say, okay, that they're Jamal Adams is the guy's name. He's going to be big time next year. But look at who he plays with, and you look at the Tre'Davious Whites and some of the others in that secondary. Quinn Blanding excels really with no help, so he's a player to keep an eye on there. There's nobody at the moment I've seen that I would want to sort of commit to in the same extent as Sean Coleman. The guy I just mentioned, Deshaun Hall at Texas A&M, had an incredible start to the year last season. Was just I want to say he had like a 4-sack game against Arizona State right off the bat and just looked incredible. But then as the year went on, he had less and less impact, and Myles Garrett sort of came into his own and sort of took over that defensive line. But he is somebody to keep an eye on because at his best, he's like 6'6", big guy, can move inside as well. He's somebody to really keep an eye on there. There's a lot of very interesting players like Ethan Pocic, who is probably the best center. It probably has to move over to guard though because he's enormous. He's listed at 6'7", so I don't think he's gonna be able to stick at center. And There is one player who you're kind of really tempted to want to like, Kenny, and that's OJ Howard at Alabama. Because the way that he played in the national title game, you think, well, he could be another brilliant, athletic tight end, but he's been so inconsistent in his Alabama career. You kind of want to see him put a consistent year together. And if there's one player who, you just can't help but really, really like, I guess it's Christian McCaffrey at Stanford. We've talked a bit about him, major production machine, thoroughly Monday weapon. And to sort of give you, I know I've given you a lot of names here. Two others that I really like are Tre'Davious White. We talked a lot about last season, thought he was going to declare. Cam Sutton, same thing, thought he was going to declare. Really, two great cornerbacks there. And, the other names are pretty obvious. Tim Williams, everybody thinks he's going to have a massive year. And Jared Davis, who's a guy at Florida. Every time you watched Jonathan Bullard or Keanu Neal, Jared Davis stood out as a really, really athletic, big-time defender. In fact, to sort of answer your question, if there was one person watching somebody else who really, really stood out, I'd probably go with Jared Davis at Florida, linebacker.
And we're gonna get out of here, but just one other thing about next year's class and the guys that you mentioned in this post and the guys that I see on the mock drafts already. We always see Deshaun Watson as the number one quarterback, but then right after him is Brad Kaya, and every single the quarterback at Miami, and every single person that does it says this guy is really disappointing. And it's like, yeah, he's this huge recruit, and he goes to Miami. And as a freshman, he goes out there and he throws 26 touchdowns, 12 interceptions. Definitely some things to improve on, but definitely a really good season for a freshman. And then the next season or last season, his yards per attempt goes down a little bit. He throws 10 fewer touchdowns. He does throw 7 fewer interceptions, but 16 touchdowns, 5 interceptions. It doesn't stand out in any sort of way. And you could say, well, it's the team around it, but people don't even say that. They say this guy was supposed to be better, and we think that, but we're already saying that he's going to be a top 5 pick. Is Brad Kaya sort of? I know that it's all dependent, but we've got 2 full seasons out of the guy. What do you think? Do you think that Brad Kaya will sort of be next year's Matt Barkley or Christian Hackenberg?
Well, he's very toolsy. So, he has a lot of the things you want in a quarterback. So he's got the height. I think his arm strength is better than some people have suggested. He throws a very pretty deep ball. He can be accurate. The one thing that I've kind of picked up watching him quite a lot is that he just is very erratic. So you will sort of see him lead a drive and look like a pro quarterback 1 minute, and then towards the end of the game, maybe Florida, they're playing Florida State or Florida or something like that, and they need a drive to sort of just finish things off, or they need a drive to come back and win the game. And he's never been able to do it. And I think one of the big problems in college football, Kenny, is that there are so few quarterback coaches in college football now. There are so few sort of like these gurus. You think, there's one at Florida right now, and you really hope that they're going to get a quarterback that he can mold. Yeah, but apart from that, Jim Harbaugh's perhaps another one. There just isn't any great head coach there who you could say, get the quarterback. You're a pro-style quarterback, and you've come through high school, and you need a school where you're going to learn, and you're going to be great, and you're going to have the best chance to be a pro. You go to that school. That's the tough thing. There isn't really.
Yeah, is there any talk of Michigan and Jim Harbaugh? Does he ever recruit a freshman coming in next year, or a guy last year that could be like the second coming? Because he's got a pretty good track record.
Yeah, I think. I can't remember any names, but I seem to remember they were talking to 2 quarterbacks who they were looking to recruit, and I think
Dylan
he nailed
McCaffrey.
Well, they definitely got one good quarterback in there. I think they got the top recruit in the nation, actually, Michigan. I think they got he's the defensive tackle. I think they got the top recruit in the country to go there. So he's going to get guys. He's going to get players to come in.
Yeah.
But you need coaches like that, because the problem with Brad Kaya's had, he had Al Golden there, didn't really seem to know what he was doing at Miami. And he's not developed at all. And this is the problem that Hackenberg had, is that he had 1 year with a head coach who coached in the NFL with the Patriots and then went off to Houston. And then the replacement that Penn State went for was the total opposite. It was a coach who'd been at Vanderbilt who was very much enshrined in college football and trying to create a system that was productive as opposed to beneficial to the players within the system. And Christian Hackenberg never took any steps forward. And college football is riddled with players like that. Now, the good thing for Brad Kaya is the coach who has taken over at Miami from Al Golden has had a history at Georgia of at least never having sort of like great physical talent at quarterback, but at least having good quarterbacks. You know, he had Matt Stafford, and then he had the guy who was an undrafted free agent or late round pick who went to Kansas City. I can't remember his name. But they've kind of had quarterbacks at Georgia who have at least shown some level of competence.
Aaron Murray,
that's it. So, you know, you kind of hope that, I mean, Kaya doesn't have to declare this year, but if he sort of has one good year with his coach, maybe he would declare. I think the best thing for him maybe to have 2 years with this coach, go into the draft in 2018 with a body of work which has prepared him sufficiently for the NFL. But, you know, he was a big-time recruit. I think that there's a lot of potential there, but he's never really developed beyond what he was as a freshman, and he's going to have to do that for teams to buy into him as an early pick.
and you're working on your 2018 mock draft, right?
Oh, yeah. I've done a 3000 one because that's the next podcast.
Well, you know, that's it. And it's the final words is Jim Harbaugh used to coach at Stanford, where obviously he coached up Andrew Luck. Stanford's number one star, Heisman candidate Christian McCaffrey is there right now. Going to be part of that incredible running back class next year. Christian McCaffrey, his dad is Ed McCaffrey, the former Broncos receiver, and Ed McCaffrey's one of his other sons is a guy by the name of Dylan McCaffrey, who has committed. He's the number one pocket passer in 2017, and he's committed to play for Jim Harbaugh at Michigan. So there you go. That's the connections that you like to hear. And the podcast that you likes to hear is 3000 NFL Mock Draft. So thank you for listening once again. Follow on Twitter at Rob Staten and at Kenneth Arthur S. And go to SeahawksDraftBlog.com and FieldGoals.com and come back next week for another episode. That's been this draft. Come back for the next one.